In this video, we will talk about reading as information processing, a very simple introductory approach to what this might mean. As we've seen already, written language is best thought of as grafted onto spoken language forms. We've already said that written language is a visual representation of spoken language elements, in particular forms, not meanings. So let us break this down into the components a little bit. What does it mean that spoken language maps onto meanings? How is that happening? And how does written language become converted into spoken language forms? Let us first think of the oral language component, which is in place before anybody can learn to read. So in this kind of drawing, I am illustrating a theoretical, a possible sequence of steps and kinds of information or representation that are involved in understanding spoken language. And I am oversimplifying it by talking mostly about words and not more complex and more realistic forms of spoken language. So at the bottom here, it says speech. Speech is sound, is something that you can record and you can listen to. Now, this speech has linguistic information, that is the speech sounds or phonemes, which you can recognize when you listen to speech in a language you are familiar with and understand. You can probably not do this in other languages. But if you're listening to English or Norwegian, then the sound becomes a mental representation of phonemes in your mind. So this is a different kind of information your mind represents after processing this speech that comes through your ears. Then these phonemes are organized in words and word parts. So these are phonological word forms. This is how words or word parts sound, how they're made up of speech sounds. And your mind can represent these phonological word forms, which are words you already know. So it is how the words that you know sound, and you can recognize these based on the speech you've heard. So your mind can tell what word you're listening to, and then of course your mind can map these forms to their meanings. So when you hear a word, then you know what this word means. And if you hear a whole bunch of words forming a grammatical sentence in your language, then you can derive the sentence meaning based on the word meanings and their syntax in this sentence. So this illustration shows a very simplified sequence of information processing steps that a mind can take, can process this information to reach the meaning of a sentence that is spoken. The ability to do all of these is part of what is called receptive oral language. So here we're only looking at understanding a spoken sentence as a sequence of words. We're not looking at producing language or at responding to this in any way, just understanding it. The ability to do this is acquired by preschool already. So children in preschool already speak their language to a quite proficient level. And getting to this point is called by linguists language acquisition, or often it's called language development, because language abilities develop along with the individual child, along with other abilities and skills. Now, in contrast to this, there is a bunch of things that children learn to do when they go to school typically. So what they learn to do is when there is a piece of writing, which is something you can take a picture of. So down here is not something in the mind, it's something on a piece of paper or on screen, something you can literally take a picture of. But This goes into your mind because you're looking at it, your eyes send information to the visual areas of your brain, and then your mind recognizes letters or groups of letters called graphemes because you know their shapes. So you represent in your mind what letters you're looking at. And you can represent in your mind orthographic word forms, which is the sequences of letters that form words in your language that you already know. So known, familiar sequences of letters in your language are orthographic word forms. And what your mind does when you read, when you can read, is it can map letters to phonemes, or it can map orthographic word forms, so known sequences of letters, to phonological word forms, so entire spoken forms of words. So your mind can link these things, and by learning these links, you learn to read. And this is a bit more detail into the sense by which written language is grafted on a pre-existing spoken language. And here we're now talking about some theoretical components of this mental mechanism and the kinds of representations that these components operate on. This new part here is called receptive written language, or word reading, is taught at school and is called learning to read. Sometimes we use the term reading development, but we mean learning to read. We don't mean something similar to language development or language acquisition, which is simply acquired by virtue of being part of a linguistic community and growing up socially interacting with other members of it. So this is something that's taught at school and involves active learning. The way we conceive of reading after several decades of research involves two different levels of processing. So what do we mean by levels? The first level is called word level. And by talking about word level processing, we mean the recognition of single words. So knowing which word we're looking at when we're looking at it, and also the processing of word sequences. That's also word level. So the ability to process words one after the other in a sequence is word level processing without doing anything about the structure of the sequence or about the meaning of more than a single word. So this only involves individual words and the ability to deal with them one after the other. In contrast to word level, we also have text level processing. And text level processing involves everything that has to do with two or more words at the same time. So that could be linguistic structure, such as syntax, meaning of entire phrases, integration of phrases across different texts and backgrounds and what you already know, and everything that has to do with understanding what you're reading. So going back to our shape, this is writing. So this is a written representation of a word. And of course, the point of reading something is to understand it. So in this simplified diagram, you could imagine that we want to go from this thing that's on paper to thinking of this in your mind. But when we study reading, we understand that in order to get to this thing in your mind, we pass through something that can be spoken. So when you see this printed on paper, you represent in your mind something that can lead you to say milk. What can that be? What are the kinds of information that we're talking about? If we use this example according to the previous description, we can represent in the mind the identities of the individual letters we're looking at. So we know we're looking at M, E, N. If this is a frequently encountered word, a familiar word, then this is also represented in the mind. So this particular sequence of 4 letters is familiar. We can recognize it. We know that we know it. What else can the mind do? Well, the mind can map these letters to their corresponding phonemes, and in this way reach a representation that can lead to pronunciation. Or the mind can map this sequence of letters to this sequence of phonemes, and then this is a known phonological form, a known word in the oral vocabulary that can then be pronounced. So we can go from the writing to letters, phonemes, pronunciation, or from letters to entire orthographic word forms, and from their phonological word forms. This is recognizing a spoken word we know, and we can then either pronounce it or understand it, or both, of course. This red part here, all of this red part, is what we usually study when we say we study word reading. So we're interested in recognizing the written forms and converting them into something that can be spoken, whether or not we actually end up pronounce it. So sometimes you'll see the term visual word recognition. In contrast, going up from here into meanings, first word meanings, and then the meanings of sequences of words, taking their order into account, this is a different subfield of reading that has to do with comprehension. So when we study this part, we study reading comprehension. But when we study this part, we study word reading. These are actually different subfields in the study of reading and reading acquisition and reading difficulties. And there's very good reason for them being separate, because they're affected by different skills, and children can have difficulties in either one of them independently of the other to some extent. So more generally, what kinds of problems are possible in this network of representations and operations, processes for going one to the other? Obviously, the first part is language problems. So if someone has difficulties with going from sound, from a speech, to understanding the phonemes, the words, and their meanings, so problem with receptive oral language, this is a language problem. Note that the arrows are outside of this box. Language problem concerns only the pure language aspect, the pre-existing aspect of development that has to do with oral language. If someone has difficulty converting knowledge of words or knowledge of phonemes into articulatory movements to produce these words, or with the execution of these articulatory movements to produce these words, then someone has speech problems, and these are different. So, for example, it's very important for speech therapists to be able to distinguish phonological problems from articulation problems. If someone has a language issue with their phonological word forms or with distinguishing different sounds, that requires a very different approach from someone who has difficulty converting that into something that can be articulated or with actually executing the articulation. Now, a completely different area here concerns cognitive or intellectual problems. And these have to do with the understanding of meanings, which includes word meanings and their relationships to one another and their relationships to everything else that you know in your entire conceptual world. You will see that it's not possible to completely separate language from general intellectual problems when it comes to understanding up here. So there is some overlap here. But it is important to distinguish for speech therapists whether there are difficulties with these information processing steps, which are language problems, or with more general understanding challenges, which indicates more general cognitive difficulties. And beyond all of these, now we have our own subfield here, which has to do with reading problems. Reading problems concern difficulties ranging from things like recognizing letters or recognizing orthographic word forms or learning the identities of letters or becoming familiar with word forms or with mapping these onto the oral language representations that you already have. So difficulties going to either of these representations or from these representations are what are properly termed reading problems. So if you're thinking about these representations and operations, then you can begin to separate different kinds of problems and how you can plan an assessment in order to identify where the root of any problems are, or if there are multiple problems, and therefore to be able to justify an intervention approach for them.